Hello, my name is David Morgan, and what I'm about to tell you is not easy for me. It's the kind of memory that crawls under your skin and stays there. It happened one evening at my parents' house when the whole family was gathered. The air was full of noise, laughter, kids running around, the smell of dinner in the kitchen. On the outside, it looked like a perfect family night. But for me, it became the night that changed everything. My older brother, Mark, has always been the star. The one people praised, the one everyone compared me to. He had the nice car, the expensive suits, the kind of life that looked flawless on the surface. And me, I was still trying to build myself up, still struggling to keep a balance between bills and survival. I thought maybe, just maybe, my family respected the fact that I never gave up. But that illusion shattered in a single moment. In front of everyone, uncles, cousins, even neighbors who dropped by. Mark looked straight at me, smirked, and said, "David, you're worthless. You're broke. You'll never be anything but a burden. Just look at yourself." Pathetic. The room went silent for a second. Some people laughed nervously. Some looked away. My father shifted uncomfortably. My mother froze in her chair. And me, I sat there, every word cutting deeper than the last. My chest burned, my throat tightened, and my heart pounded so hard, I thought it might explode. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to scream in his face, tell him he was wrong. But instead, I stayed silent. My silence wasn't weakness, though, it was survival. I clenched my jaw, forced my eyes to stay cold, and let his words sink into me like knives. He grinned, proud of himself, as if my silence was his victory. And in that very moment, something changed inside me. A fire lit in my chest. I didn't know how or when, but I swore that night would not be forgotten. His words would not be the last word. When the evening ended, I walked out of that house feeling smaller than ever, but also sharper than ever. I went home, laid in bed, and stared at the ceiling until tears burned down my face. Not loud sobs, just quiet tears that left my pillow wet and my soul heavy. His words echoed in my head, worthless, broke, pathetic. But life has a strange way of balancing things, because 2 days later, Mark lost everything. And I don't mean a small loss. I mean the kind of collapse that strips a man bare and leaves him gasping for air. The day after that humiliation, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. The air felt heavy, like the world itself was pressing down on my chest. My brother's words weren't just insults, they were chains. I kept hearing them on repeat, worthless, broke, pathetic. And no matter how hard I tried to shake them off, they dug deeper into me. I stayed inside most of the morning, pacing back and forth like a man trapped in his own cage. My phone buzzed on the table. A group chat with my cousins lit up the screen. I didn't want to open it, but curiosity got the better of me. And the moment I read those messages, I felt something inside me snap. They were joking about me. They were making fun of the way I sat silent, the way I looked down at the floor while my brother tore me apart. They wrote things like, "Poor David, too broke to even defend himself." And Mark was brutal, but damn, he wasn't lying. I stared at the screen until my hands shook. These weren't strangers. These were people I grew up with, people I trusted. And here they were, laughing at my pain, feeding off my humiliation like it was entertainment. It was then I understood the cruel truth. When you stumble, the ones closest to you don't always reach to catch you. Sometimes they just watch you fall. Sometimes they even enjoy the show. That realization was worse than anything, Mark had said. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark with a bottle of water in my hand, staring at the shadows on the wall. My silence wasn't weakness. No, my silence was storing something bigger, something darker. And then, life moved faster than I could. 2 days after that family dinner, my father called me into the living room. His face was pale, his voice heavy. "David, did you hear what happened to Mark?" I shook my head, my heart racing. My father sighed, rubbed his forehead, and said, "His deal, the big one he's been talking about for months, it collapsed. Everything's gone. The investors pulled out, the banks froze his accounts. He's finished." For a second, I just stood there, speechless. I should have felt pity. I should have felt the sting of sympathy, but I didn't. Instead, deep inside me, a fire that had been burning quietly roared to life. I didn't smile, I didn't laugh, I didn't celebrate. But I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Justice. Pure, undeniable justice. And that justice was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I don't know why, but something inside me pushed me to check my phone. The family group chat was buzzing again, but this time it wasn't about me. Every message, every line was about Mark. Apparently, word had already spread beyond our family. Friends, colleagues, even neighbors were whispering about his downfall. People who once praised him were now gossiping behind his back. Some pretended to be shocked, others openly enjoyed it. And for the first time in years, the spotlight was no longer on me, it was on him. I scrolled through the messages, my chest tightening with each word. My cousins who laughed at me just days ago were now saying things like, "Mark flew too close to the sun, and guess pride really does come before the fall." The same mouths that cheered him on were now tearing him apart. I should have felt sorry. After all, he was my brother. But instead, I felt something I couldn't ignore, a grim satisfaction. Not because I hated him, but because for once, life had spoken for me. I didn't have to defend myself. I didn't have to raise my voice. Life itself had slapped him harder than I ever could. Later that day, I saw him. He came by our parents' house, the same place where he humiliated me. But this time, the man who walked through that door didn't look like the arrogant brother I knew. His shoulders were heavy, his suit wrinkled, his eyes hollow. He didn't even greet anyone properly. He just sat down, buried his face in his hands, and stayed silent. The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 nights ago, he basked in the power of making me small with his words. Now he couldn't even lift his head. He looked broken, and for a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. But then I remembered the sting of his words.
The way he made me feel like dirt in front of everyone I loved. That memory hardened me again. I realized something important. Humiliation doesn't disappear overnight, it stays. It carves you open and makes you bleed long after the moment is gone. And that's when another thought crept into my mind. Maybe this was only the beginning. Maybe this wasn't just about watching him fall. Maybe deep down I was meant to take this further, to make him feel the weight of what he had done to me.
To make him taste the same bitterness he forced down my throat. That night as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling again. But this time I wasn't drowning in pain. No, this time there was a strange calm in my chest. A quiet voice whispering inside me, "Your silence was never weakness. It was preparation." And for the first time I realized revenge wasn't just an idea. It was becoming my reality. The following week felt unreal. Everywhere I went, I heard whispers about Mark. At the grocery store, in the neighborhood cafe, even walking down the street, people who once looked at him with admiration now spoke his name with pity, or worse, with ridicule. Mark Morgan, didn't he just lose everything? Yeah, I heard his investors pulled out. Some even sued him. They say pride was his downfall. The same people who used to praise his success now treated him like a cautionary tale. I watched all of this unfold in silence. The same silence that had once been forced on me, only this time it wasn't crushing me, it was shielding me. Inside our home, things weren't any better for him. My father barely looked him in the eye. My mother, who had always defended him, spoke to him with disappointment, heavy in her voice. The golden child had fallen, and the family balance shifted in ways none of us expected. But what caught me the most wasn't their disappointment, it was his eyes. Whenever Mark looked at me, I saw something new, a flicker of insecurity, maybe even shame. He didn't speak of that night anymore, didn't mock me, didn't smirk. He avoided me like the weight of his own words haunted him, and I let him. I didn't chase him, I didn't talk to him. I just let silence fill the space between us like poison. One evening, I walked past his room in our parents' house. The door was half open, and I saw him sitting at the edge of the bed, phone in his hand, scrolling furiously. His hair was messy, his face unshaven. He looked like a man clawing for a lifeline that wasn't there. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I leaned against the wall, watching him quietly. He hadn't noticed me. He kept muttering under his breath, cursing, sighing. And for the first time, I saw fear in him. Real fear. Not of losing money, but of losing the image he had built. The identity he had wrapped himself in. Without the success, without the wealth. Mark was nothing but a fragile man exposed to the world. And that's when I understood something I never had before. Humiliation is heavier for men like him. For men who build their thrones on pride. The fall isn't just painful, it's unbearable. That night, lying in bed, I realized revenge didn't always have to be loud, or violent, or immediate. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is patience. Sometimes it's letting someone destroy themselves while you stand tall, untouched. But a darker thought began to take root in me. Maybe silence wasn't enough anymore. Maybe watching wasn't enough. Maybe I wanted him to feel it deeper, to taste the kind of pain that doesn't fade. And in that moment, I knew my story with Mark wasn't over. It was just beginning. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the image of Mark sitting alone in that room, broken, drowning in his own pride. I thought that humiliation would be enough. I thought his downfall would satisfy me. But it didn't, not fully. The memory of his words, the way he made me small in front of everyone, still cut too deep. So I began to wonder, what if I didn't just wait for life to keep punishing him? What if I pushed it a little further? I didn't jump into it recklessly. No, I studied him first. I paid attention. Mark had always been flashy, but now I noticed his desperation. He was calling people constantly, trying to salvage whatever scraps of reputation he had left. He begged old investors to trust him again. Tried convincing family friends to lend him money. Every call ended the same: disappointment, rejection, sometimes outright laughter. And I stood there watching quietly. He didn't know it, but I knew more about his life now than I ever had before. I learned his patterns, who he spoke to, where he went, how he tried to claw his way back up. And slowly an idea began to form. One evening, I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. My father was sitting at the table reading the newspaper, shaking his head. Without even looking up, he muttered, "Your brother, he's digging himself deeper every day. He's reckless. He hasn't learned a thing." I didn't answer, but inside I smiled. Because my father was right. Mark was desperate, and desperation makes people sloppy. It makes them vulnerable. Later that night, Mark left his phone on the counter while he went to the bathroom. I shouldn't have touched it. I know that. But temptation has a way of whispering louder when your blood still carries old wounds. I picked it up, glanced at the screen, and what I saw confirmed everything. He was trying to start a new deal, a rushed, shady partnership with men I knew couldn't be trusted. In that moment, I had a choice. I could leave it alone, let him chase after another illusion, or I could tip the scales, just enough to make sure he dug his own grave deeper. When he came back, I placed the phone down exactly where it was, my face calm, my hands steady, but inside I already knew I wasn't just gonna watch anymore. I was gonna play a part, quietly, carefully, the kind of revenge that doesn't scream, it whispers. And for the first time, I felt something close to power. The night I saw those shady names in Mark's phone, something shifted inside me. Until then, I'd been a spectator, letting life do the punishing. But now, I was ready to take the wheel. Not recklessly, not loudly. No, my revenge would be quiet, careful, invisible. Mark had always been reckless with trust. He loved the idea of fast money, of building empires overnight, and desperation had blinded him even more. He didn't see that the men he was reaching out to weren't allies. They were vultures circling a wounded animal. I knew one of them personally, a man named Victor Hale. Victor wasn't the type you did business with unless you wanted your life ripped apart. He smiled while shaking your hand, then gutted you the moment you turned your back. I'd crossed paths with him years ago while working a temporary job, and even back then I knew he was poison. That night I made a decision. I called Victor. I kept my voice low, calm, almost casual. "Victor," I said, "my brother Mark's been trying to reach you. He's desperate. I just thought you should know something. He's got nothing left. He's broke. He's unstable. And he'll cling to any deal you put in front of him." Victor chuckled on the other end. "Good to know, David. I like men who cling. Makes them easier to handle." I hung up, a cold shiver running through me. For a moment, guilt tried to creep in. He was still my brother after all. But then I remembered the fire in his eyes when he called me worthless. I remembered the sting of silence while everyone watched me drown in humiliation, and the guilt turned to steel. Over the next few days, I noticed the changes. Mark walked around with a flicker of false confidence again, as if he'd found new hope. He started dressing sharp, forcing smiles, bragging about a new project that was going to save him. He didn't know that the very deal he thought would rebuild him was already poisoned by my words, by my silence, by the strings I had pulled. Our parents didn't see it. To them, Mark was trying to rise again. But I saw the cracks behind his smile, the desperation in his laughter. He was running into a fire and he thought it was light, and I was the one holding the match. That night, lying in bed, I felt something dark but undeniable control. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being crushed under his shadow. I was the one shaping it. And as I stared into the darkness, a thought pulsed in my mind. This is only the beginning. Mark's confidence came back fast, almost too fast. Within a week, he was talking louder, walking taller, throwing around promises he couldn't keep. He sat at the dinner table telling my parents about a new golden opportunity, painting pictures of wealth and success like an artist covering up cracks on a broken canvas. My father looked skeptical, my mother hopeful. They wanted to believe him, they always did. And me, I stayed silent, sipping my water, hiding the storm inside my chest, because I knew exactly who he was dealing with and I knew where it would end. One night I walked past the living room and overheard him on the phone. His voice was sharp, excited. "Yes, Victor, I'm ready to sign. Don't worry, I'll have the money. This will be bigger than anything I've ever done." Hearing Victor's name on his lips confirmed everything. My words had worked. He'd taken the bait. I should have felt proud. But instead, something strange crept into me, a heaviness. For a brief second, I wondered if I'd gone too far. He was my brother. After all, blood. And as much as I hated him for what he'd done, part of me remembered the boy we once were playing in the backyard, laughing, sharing secrets only brothers know. That memory stabbed at me. But then, as quickly as it came, it vanished. Because memories don't erase scars. Blood doesn't erase betrayal. And humiliation doesn't disappear with time. It burns until you feed it justice. Over the next few days, I watched him pour what little he had left into Victor's scheme. He sold his car, borrowed money from friends, even pawned some of my father's old gifts. He told everyone this was his comeback, that soon we'd all see him on top again. But I could see the truth hiding in his eyes. Desperation, panic. The smile he wore was a mask, and behind it his world was already collapsing. One evening, as he boasted about his plans, he looked at me across the table. His eyes narrowed, almost like he sensed something. "You'll see, David," he said, his voice sharp. "I'll rise again, and when I do, people like you will eat your words." For a moment, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because he didn't realize. I hadn't said a single word. I hadn't needed to. My silence had become my sharpest weapon. That night, I lay in bed listening to the rain tapping against my window. And with every drop, I felt it clearer and clearer. Mark wasn't walking towards salvation. He was walking into his own grave. And I was the one who quietly dug the hole. The only question was, how deep would I let him sink before I stopped? At first, everything looked perfect for Mark. Victor played his role well. Smooth, charming, dripping with promises. Mark strutted around the house like he'd already won. He talked about buying a bigger place, traveling abroad, maybe even starting a new company. He wasn't just dreaming. He was dragging everyone into his fantasy. My mother believed him again, smiling through her tears, praying for his success. My father, though cautious, allowed a flicker of hope. And me, I stayed quiet. Watching, waiting, then came the first crack. Mark had transferred a large chunk of money to Victor. Days passed, then weeks. No progress, no contracts, just excuses. Victor always had a reason. The market shifted, papers delayed, investors negotiating. But anyone with a brain could see it. The story didn't add up. Mark, however, clung to every excuse like it was gospel. He couldn't afford to believe he was being played. He needed this win too badly. One night, I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water and saw him hunched over his laptop, his face pale in the glow of the screen. He was reading messages from Victor, and for the first time I saw it. Doubt. His hands trembled, his lips pressed tight. That unstoppable arrogance, it was slipping. I leaned on the counter, pretending not to notice. "Problem?" I asked softly. He snapped his head up, defensive. "No, just business. Don't worry about it." But I could hear it in his voice, fear. A few days later, the hammer fell. Victor vanished. His number stopped working. His office address turned out fake, and the deal evaporated into thin air. Mark was destroyed. Completely. He tried calling, emailing, searching, nothing. It was as if the man had never existed. I watched him crumble piece by piece. The anger, the shame. The horror of realizing he had been outplayed in the same way he once outplayed others. He slammed doors, cursed at the walls, begged the heavens for answers. And me, I just sat quietly in my room, listening. Every cry, every shout, every broken sob, it was music. The irony was brutal. He had fallen into the same kind of trap he once set for others. Except this time, there was no way out. But as much as satisfaction warmed me, another thought crept into my mind. This wasn't the end. Not yet. This was only the beginning of his real punishment. Because losing money was nothing. What I had planned next would break him far deeper. I watched the wreckage settle like ash and realized losing money was the smallest cut I could give him. Real ruin lives in the eyes of people who once admired you, and I decided to make sure every single person who ever cheered for Mark would see him for what he really was. I started small, nothing that would scream revenge at first, a whispered question here, a carefully placed document there, but each move was measured. Surgical. I met with an old college friend of his who still worked at a local paper and mentioned casually that some of Mark's recent investors had names that didn't check out. I left out my involvement and let curiosity do the rest. I printed copies of the emails Victor had sent, the ones that hinted at false promises and fake contracts, and slipped them into the folders of casual acquaintances who liked to gossip at lunch. I reached out to a past business contact of his, not to expose him directly, but to remind them of a conversation where Mark had boasted about cutting corners to close deals. Every nudge I made was like a stone tossed into still water. The ripples grew wider than I expected. Soon, people who had once raised him on a pedestal began to ask questions. Old friends who had toasted his success stopped by my parents' house with pity in their eyes and whispers on their lips. At a neighborhood party, a woman I barely knew edged closer and said, in a voice loud enough for my mother to hear, "I heard Mark's latest investors were fake. Poor thing, he must be desperate." My mother's face tightened. I felt the air change, like the room had shifted on its axis. Watching him walk into a room and feel those looks, the sudden cold of people who'd once smiled, was a cruelty I'd never thought I could orchestrate, and it lit something darker inside me. But along with that satisfaction came a flash of something else. A memory of the boy who'd laughed at the creek with me, who'd once defended me from kids in school. It hit me and then recoiled because memories don't heal the wounds he left. Mark, meanwhile, started to unravel in public. He'd show up at family gatherings with forced charm, overcompensating with jokes that landed like stones. An old client who had once praised him now avoided his handshake. A cousin asked him bluntly if he'd been honest with investors, right there in front of everyone. He flinched and stammered, calling them liars even as his eyes darted for an escape. I saw him try to reclaim dignity by spinning new tales, claims of a pending rescue, a partner who'd come through. But the more he lied, the deeper the hole he dug. People love a spectacle, and shame is the theater that keeps them watching. Seeing Mark perform desperation for an audience he once owned felt like the final act of a play I'd written in silence. There were nights I lay awake calculating how far I'd go, whether exposing the full truth would finally snap him, or whether I should keep him suspended in that slow-burning humiliation until he collapsed under the weight of his own pride. And as the town's whispers grew louder, as his name turned from praise to cautionary tale, I realized the story was no longer just his to tell. It belonged to everyone who had ever believed his lies. And I had given them a front row seat. By the time the whispers turned into open conversations, Mark was no longer the man he pretended to be. His eyes gave him away before his words ever did. They were sunken, restless, twitching like he expected every corner to hold another betrayal. And in a way it did, because betrayal was exactly what I was feeding him, spoon by spoon. One evening, I walked past his office door and saw him tearing papers apart, shredding contract he once paraded in front of everyone. His desk was a graveyard of unpaid bills and letters stamped in red ink. He didn't notice me standing there watching him crumble, the same way he had once stood over me while I drowned in humiliation. But this wasn't enough. Pain in private can still be hidden. Shame and silence can still be denied. I wanted him to feel exposed, raw, stripped in the exact way he stripped me. And so I made sure the stories about his failures reached the one place he worshipped most, our father's ears. My father had always been his biggest defender. No matter how reckless Mark behaved, Dad found a way to justify it. He's ambitious, he takes risks, he'll learn. I used to ache for that kind of defense, for someone to believe in me even when I failed. But with me, Dad only had silence. With Mark, he had faith. Until now. One night at dinner, I slid a newspaper across the table. A small article buried in the business section. It mentioned a fraudulent deal in the city, a scam linked to unnamed investors. I didn't say a word, but I knew Dad would read between the lines. Mark froze when he saw it, his fork clattering against the plate. My father's expression didn't change. It hardened. That silence, it cut sharper than any shout. After dinner, I overheard them in the study. My father's voice was low but furious. "You've embarrassed this family," he said. "Do you know how many people have called me, asking if the stories are true?" Mark tried to fight back, his voice trembling, desperate. "It wasn't my fault. I was tricked. I just need more time. But Dad didn't buy it. For the first time in my life, I heard disappointment, not excuse, in his tone. And Mark sounded like a boy again. Not the man who once towered over me with cruel words. I should have felt pity, I should have, but I didn't. Instead, I felt something else, a dark satisfaction I'd never tasted before. Because humiliation wasn't just returning to him, it was multiplying, and I knew this was only the second act. His downfall was far from finished. The days after my father's confrontation broke something in Mark. He didn't walk with that same swagger anymore. He paced instead, restless, chewing at his nails, checking his phone like salvation might come through a message. But it never did. He began calling old friends, the ones who used to crowd around him when money flowed like wine. I heard him late at night, his voice shifting from charm to pleading, sometimes even to anger. You know I always came through for you, he'd say. I just need one more chance, one more investment. But those friends, they weren't blind anymore. They'd heard the whispers, they'd read the rumors. And when a man bleeds, the crowd doesn't run in to save him. They run in to watch. His desperation grew so raw, it was almost pathetic. I found him one morning at the kitchen table, stacks of unpaid bills spread out in front of him like a cruel mosaic. He didn't even notice me at first. He just muttered under his breath, counting, scribbling, erasing, starting over. Then his eyes caught mine, and for a flicker of a second, I thought I saw shame, but it vanished, replaced by that old anger. What are you looking at? He snapped. I didn't answer. Silence was my sharpest knife, but silence wasn't all I had. I began to feed the fire quietly. Whenever he'd leave his phone on the counter, I'd glance at his emails, sometimes forwarding the most desperate ones to people I knew would spread them. A single screenshot of him begging for money was all it took to fan the gossip into flames. By the end of that week, half the town knew Mark Morgan, the once proud, untouchable man, was on his knees. The humiliation started seeping into his behavior. He snapped at our mother when she asked if he was okay. He cursed at the neighbors for parking too close to our driveway. And in one explosive moment, he threw a glass against the wall just because the internet went out. That wasn't the brother I grew up with. That was a cornered animal, lashing at everything because he could no longer control his world. And watching him unravel like that in front of the very family he once used to humiliate me should have been enough. But it wasn't. Every scream, every breakdown only reminded me of the night he called me worthless. The night he made my soul burn under everyone's laughter. So I kept pushing, quiet, invisible, merciless. Because revenge isn't about breaking someone in a single blow. It's about slicing them slowly until they beg for the mercy you'll never give. Mark's desperation reached a fever pitch one night at a community event. It was a fundraiser at the town hall, the kind of place where he once loved to be seen, where he thrived on shaking hands and flashing smiles. He showed up in a wrinkled suit, hair unkempt, eyes hollow, but he still tried to carry himself like the man he used to be, chest out, voice loud. At first, people humored him, a polite handshake here, a quick nod there, but I could see it, the shift in their eyes. They weren't admiring him anymore. They were watching a man unravel. Halfway through the evening, Mark spotted an old business associate across the room, a man named Harris, who had once invested heavily in him. Mark pushed through the crowd, clapped a hand on Harris's shoulder, and in a voice everyone could hear, started begging. Listen, you know me. You know what I'm capable of. I just need a small push to get back on track. $50,000, that's nothing to you. I'll pay it back triple, I swear. The room went silent. Harris pulled his hand away slowly, shaking his head. Mark, it's over. Everyone knows what happened. You need to accept it. His voice wasn't cruel, it was pity. And that pity, it destroyed him more than rejection ever could. Mark's face twisted. He laughed, but it wasn't laughter. It was the kind of sound a man makes when pride is bleeding out of him. No, you don't understand, he shouted louder this time, his voice cracking. I was scammed. I'm the victim here. Don't you dare look at me like this. People turned their heads. Whispers rippled through the crowd. My mother's eyes filled with tears. My father looked down at his shoes, and me? I stood in the corner, silent, watching the king fall from his throne. And then came the final blow. Mark stumbled onto the stage where the fundraiser host was speaking, grabbed the microphone and ranted. You think I'm finished? You think I'm some joke? His voice was slurred with panic, spit flying, words tumbling over each other. I'm Mark Morgan. I'll rise again. You'll all see. But instead of applause, instead of admiration, there was only awkward silence and then laughter. Actual laughter. Not with him. At him. the same way he once humiliated me in front of our family. I watched him humiliate himself in front of an entire town. In that moment, it carved itself into my memory like fire on stone. For the first time in years, I felt my chest lift, not with pride, but with vindication. Justice had finally shown its face, but deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end, because losing money was one thing.
Losing reputation was another, but what was coming next? That would take everything from him. After that night at the fundraiser, something in the air shifted. The laughter still echoed in people's mouths, carried into hushed conversations and cruel jokes. It spread faster than fire, faster than even I could have imagined. Wherever Mark went, the whispers followed. And you know what whispers do? They eat at a man's soul far quicker than outright rejection.
At home, the tension became unbearable. My father stopped speaking to him altogether, retreating into silence that weighed heavier than anger. My mother tried to shield him at first, offering comfort, excuses, soft words. But even she couldn't ignore the calls she kept getting. Neighbors asking what had happened, friends apologizing awkwardly, people questioning her son's honesty. Each call was another crack in the fragile image she clung to. One evening, I found her sitting alone at the kitchen table, her hands clutching rosary beads, her lips trembling. She looked up at me, eyes red, and whispered, "What did he do, David? What has my son become?" For a moment, I almost confessed everything, my silence, my small manipulations, my revenge, but I didn't. Instead, I placed a hand on hers and said, "He did it to himself," and she wept because deep down she knew it was true. Mark, on the other hand, became a ghost in our home. He avoided eye contact, spoke only when cornered, and spent hours locked away in his room. Sometimes I'd hear him pacing, other times muttering to himself as if rehearsing a defense no one would believe. His pride was rotting, but he couldn't let it go. He still tried in his own pathetic way to hold on to control. One night he cornered me in the hallway. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, his voice low and bitter. "You think you're better than me now, don't you?" he hissed. "Don't think I don't see the way you look at me, like you've won." I didn't respond. I just stared at him, calm, steady. My silence was louder than any insult, and in that silence he broke. His shoulders sagged, his jaw unclenched, and for the first time, he looked small, not just defeated, hollow. Later that week, my father called a family meeting. We all sat in the living room, the air heavy with tension. Dad looked at Mark with an expression I'll never forget. Not anger, not even disappointment anymore, just exhaust. "I can't defend you anymore," he said. "You've brought shame into this house, and you've left us to carry the weight of it. Until you fix yourself, until you own up to what you've done, you're on your own." Those words landed harder than any blow. Mark didn't fight. He didn't shout. He just sat there staring at the floor, his hands limp on his knees. My mother sobbed quietly beside him, but even she didn't argue. For the first time, the family that once worshipped him had turned away. And in that moment, watching his throne crumble and his kingdom vanish, I realized revenge wasn't just about striking back. It was about patience. It was about letting a man destroy himself piece by piece while you stood in the shadows and watched. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. When my father cut him off, it was like slicing the last thread holding Mark together. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just faded. Days turned into weeks, and Mark was barely recognizable. His suits hung loose on his frame. His eyes had that hollow glaze of someone who hadn't slept, and his voice, once booming, once commanding, was reduced to a whisper that trembled. He stopped showing up to community events, stopped returning calls, stopped pretending he had control. But what he did instead was worse. He started drinking. At first just a glass at dinner, then a bottle in his room. Then nights stumbling through the house with slurred words and broken laughter. I remember one night vividly, he stood in the driveway at 2 a.m. shouting at the stars, swearing he'd rise again, while the neighbors peeked through curtains. The man who once strutted proudly through those streets was now a spectacle, a warning, a ghost of his own pride. And as if that wasn't enough, the gambling came next. I overheard him on the phone promising debts he couldn't pay, chasing wins that never came. He sold his watch, then his car, then things from the house that weren't even his. He was clawing at the dirt, desperate to dig himself out, but every move only buried him deeper. The family grew cold. My father barely acknowledged him. My mother stopped defending him and instead prayed quietly in her room, her face older than I'd ever seen it. Even relatives stopped visiting. Mark had gone from golden child to cautionary tale, and no one wanted to be near the ruin. And me, I watched, quietly, patiently. I didn't need to lift a finger anymore. His destruction had taken on a life of its own. All I had to do was let it happen. One night he stumbled into my room uninvited, reeking of alcohol, his face flushed with desperation. "Help me," he whispered, his voice cracking like glass. I need something. Money, a chance, anything. You're my brother." And in that moment, I saw everything. The same man who once humiliated me in front of everyone, calling me worthless and broken, was now on his knees begging. The taste of revenge was sharp, intoxicating, but it wasn't complete, not yet, because revenge isn't finished until the final curtain falls. And I knew exactly how to bring it down. It all came down to one quiet evening. Mark had isolated himself completely, his pride shattered, his friends gone, his family barely acknowledging him. He was a shell of the man who once thought he could tower over me with words alone. And in that silence, I finally stepped forward. I didn't yell, I didn't gloat, I simply handed him a folder. Inside were copies of everything. Emails, messages, proof of the scam he had blindly chased, evidence of the lies he told to investors and friends. I watched him as he sifted through it, his face draining of color with every page he turned. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The lies, the failed deals, the public humiliation. All of it. Every piece was now undeniable. No excuses, no hiding, no pretending. He sank to the floor, his hands covering his face, and for the first time I saw pure, unfiltered despair. I knelt beside him and said calmly, "You wanted to humiliate me to make me feel small. You wanted to prove that you were better, stronger, untouchable. But look at yourself now. This is what happens when pride blinds you. This is what happens when you hurt people without thinking."
He didn't respond. He couldn't. The man who once laughed at my pain was now broken, silent, crushed under the weight of his own actions.
And in that moment, the revenge I had carried in my heart for so long was complete. I didn't celebrate, I didn't mock, I just walked away, letting him sit in the ruins of his own making. Because real revenge isn't loud, it's quiet, it's patience, and it's watching life restore the balance in ways words never could. And as I walked out into the cool night air, I realized something. Surviving humiliation, being patient, and standing tall, that's the only victory that truly matters. If this story touched you, if the raw truth of it resonated with something deep inside, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I share these daily stories to give you the kind of life lessons that stick, the experiences you can use, the truths you can learn from. And don't forget to share this with your friends so they too can see the power of patience, resilience, and the quiet strength that revenge teaches. Because sometimes the best lessons come wrapped in the most intense stories.